A seven-part narrative from the cockpit of Lieutenant James McKenzie, TBM Avenger pilot, VT-17, USS Hornet, Task Force 58. She was the pride of the Empire, until we sent her to the bottom. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Let me start at the beginning, back when we first heard the whispers in the ready room about the monster lurking in Japanese waters. April 1945, and we were riding high with Task Force 58, Mitcher's Fast Carrier Task Force, the most powerful naval striking force the world had ever seen. We'd been pounding the Japanese home islands for months, and their navy was supposed to be finished, scattered, broken, hiding in ports like wounded animals. But intelligence kept talking about Yamato, the biggest battleship ever built, they said. 73,000 tons of steel and fury, armed with 9 18-inch guns that could put a shell the size of a Volkswagen through a mountain 25 miles away. Her armor was so thick that our 5-inch guns might as well have been pea shooters. She was the symbol of everything the Japanese Navy had been: proud, powerful, and utterly convinced of their own invincibility. My name is James McKenzie, Mac to my squadron mates, and I flew a TBM Avenger off the USS Hornet. 23 years old, from a wheat farm outside Topeka, Kansas, where the biggest thing I'd ever seen was a grain elevator until he joined the Navy. Now I was strapped into a torpedo bomber, carrying enough explosive power to sink a destroyer, preparing to take on the mightiest warship ever launched. The briefing came down on April 6th. Commander Johnson, our air group commander, looked grim as he pointed to the charts spread across the table in the ready room. The smell of coffee and cigarette smoke hung heavy in the compartment, mixing with the ever-present aroma of aviation fuel that seemed to seep into everything aboard a carrier. "Gentlemen," Johnson began, his voice cutting through the usual chatter, "we've got a situation. Yamato sortied from Tokuyama yesterday evening, along with the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. Intelligence believes they're heading for Okinawa." The room went dead quiet. We'd all heard the stories about Yamato, how she'd been built in secret, how her guns were bigger than anything we had, how she represented the last desperate hope of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But she'd been hiding, conserving fuel, avoiding the decisive battle that would have settled things once and for all. Operation Tengo, Johnson continued, using the code name that would be burned into our memories forever. The Japs are calling it a special attack. They're sending Yamato on a one-way mission to Okinawa. No fuel for the return trip. They're going to beach her and use her as an unsinkable fortress, supporting their ground forces with those 18-inch guns. I felt my stomach tighten. Okinawa was our boys, our Marines and soldiers fighting and dying to take that island. The thought of Yamato's massive guns raining shells down on our landing beaches was enough to make anyone's blood run cold. "Sir," asked Lieutenant Tommy Garrison, our squadron's executive officer, "what's our part in this?" Johnson's smile was sharp as a blade. "We're going to sink her, Tommy. Admiral Mitcher's putting together the biggest airstrike in Pacific history. Every available aircraft from Task Force 58, nearly 400 planes. We're going to find Yamato and send her to the bottom of the East China Sea." The excitement in the room was palpable, but it was mixed with something else, fear maybe, or just a sober understanding of what we were up against. Yamato wasn't just a ship. She was a floating fortress, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, protected by a screen of destroyers and covered by land-based fighters from Kyushu. Even wounded and desperate, she was still the most dangerous warship afloat. "When do we launch?" I asked. "Dawn," Johnson replied. "We'll be part off the second wave. The dive bombers and fighters go in first to suppress the flak and deal with any air cover. Then we follow with the fish." He meant torpedoes. Our TBMs carried Mark 13 torpedoes that could punch through a battleship's hull below the waterline, where even Yamato's thick armor couldn't protect her. As the briefing broke up, I found myself thinking about the men aboard Yamato. They had to know they weren't coming back. The Japanese called it Bushido, the way of the warrior, but to us it looked like suicide. Still, there was something almost admirable about their determination, their willingness to die for their emperor and their country. Not that it would save them. We had a job to do, and we were going to do it. That night, I lay in my bunk listening to the steady thrum of the Hornet's engines as we raced north toward the intercept point. The ship was alive with activity, mechanics working on engines, ordnance men loading bombs and torpedoes, pilots studying recognition charts and going over their attack plans one more time. I thought about my parents back in Kansas, probably getting ready for spring planting. They'd gotten my last letter 2 weeks ago, where I told them about the cherry blossoms blooming in Japan and how strange it was to see such beauty in the middle of a war. I hadn't told them about the kamikaze attacks, or how we'd lost 3 pilots from the squadron in the last month, or how the flak over the Japanese home islands was thick enough to walk on. Some things were better left unsaid. Tomorrow we'd find out if all the stories about Yamato were true. Tomorrow we'd discover whether American air power could really sink the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Tomorrow we'd write the final chapter of the greatest naval war in history. The general quarters alarm shattered the pre-dawn quiet at 0400 hours. I rolled out of my bunk, already half-dressed, my mind snapping from sleep to full alertness in seconds. After 18 months in the Pacific, you learned to wake up ready to fight. The ready room was a hive of activity as pilots grabbed their gear and checked the latest weather reports. The meteorologists were predicting broken clouds at 3,000 feet, with visibility of about 10 miles, good enough for our purposes, but it meant Yamato might have some cloud cover to hide under. Listen up, Commander Johnson's voice cut through the chatter. Latest intelligence puts the Japanese force about 200 miles southwest of Kyushu, steaming south at 24 knots. They're making good speed, but they're still 6 hours away from the Okinawa landing beaches. He pointed to the chart with his wooden pointer. First wave launches at 0600, that's the Hellcats and Corsairs, plus the SB-2C Helldivers. Their job is to clear the air and start working over the escorts. We launch at 0630 with the second wave. Our target is Yamato herself. I check my watch. 0445. An hour and 45 minutes until launch. My crew chief, Petty Officer Rodriguez, would already be down in the hangar deck, making final checks on my Avenger. She was a good bird, Kansas Cyclone, I'd named her, with a picture of a tornado painted on her nose. She'd brought me through 37 combat missions, and I was counting on her to bring me through number 38. Weather's looking good, Johnson continued. Winds from the northwest at 15 knots, seas 3 to 4 feet. The Japs don't have any significant air cover. Most of their planes are being held back for the final defense of the home islands. But don't get cocky. Yamato's got more anti-aircraft guns than some of our light cruisers. The intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Harris, took over the brief. Current composition of the enemy force: Battleship Yamato, light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers. They're in a defensive formation, with Yamato in the center and the escorts screening her flanks. Best estimate is they're carrying about 2,500 to 3,000 men total. I did the math in my head. Nearly 3,000 Japanese sailors steaming toward what they had to know was certain death. It was hard not to respect their courage, even as we prepared to kill them. Approach will be from the southwest, Harris continued. We want to come out of the sun if possible. The Helldivers will attack from high altitude first, trying to knock out the anti-aircraft batteries. Then the torpedo bombers will make their runs from low level, port and starboard, trying to hit Yamato below the waterline. The tactics were sound, but I knew they were also dangerous as to make an effective torpedo attack. We'd have to come in low and slow, boring straight into the teeth of Yamato's defensive fire. The Mark 13 torpedoes were good weapons, but they were temperamental. They had to be dropped from exactly the right altitude and speed, or they'd either break apart when they hit the water or run too deep to strike the target. Any questions? Johnson asked. Sir, I raised my hand. What about our own air cover? Are we going to have fighter escort? Negative, Johnson replied. Every available Hellcat and Corsair is going in with the first wave. We'll be on our own once we start our attack runs. But remember, Yamato is a big target, and she can't hide. Once we find her, we keep hitting her until she goes down. The briefing broke up, and I headed down to the hangar deck to check on Kansas Cyclone. The hangar was a controlled chaos of activity. Blue-shirted plane handlers pushing aircraft around, red-shirted ordnance men loading bombs and torpedoes, yellow-shirted flight deck directors checking launching sequences. The smell of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid filled the air, mixed with the aroma of coffee and bacon from the galley. Rodriguez was waiting for me beside my Avenger, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "She's ready to go, Lieutenant," he said with a grin. "Engines checked out perfect, torpedoes armed and ready, and I even managed to scrounge up an extra box of 50 caliber for the turret gun." I walked around the plane, checking the control surfaces, the propeller, the landing gear. The Mark 13 torpedo slung under her belly looked massive, 2,000 pounds of explosive death in a streamlined package. It was hard to believe that something so sleek and deadly had started life as a drawing on an engineer's blueprint. "Thanks, Rodriguez," I said. "How about the radio?" "Crystal clear, sir. I tested it an hour ago." My radioman gunner, aviation radioman second class Danny O'Malley, was already in the rear cockpit checking his equipment. Danny was a kid from Boston, barely 20 years old, but he'd been with me for 8 months, and I trusted him completely. He manned the 50 caliber turret gun that protected our tail, and his steady voice over the intercom had talked me through more than one tough situation. "Morning, Lieutenant," Danny called out. "Weather looks good for flying." "Let's hope it stays that way," I replied, climbing up into the cockpit. The instrument panel was familiar as my own face: altimeter, airspeed indicator, fuel gauge, engine temperature, oil pressure. I'd flown this same type of aircraft for over a year, but I still went through the same pre-flight checklist every time. In combat, the little things could kill you just as dead as enemy fire. At 0530, the hangar deck crew began moving the aircraft up to the flight deck. The Hornet's massive elevators lifted us into the gray dawn light, where the deck crew quickly spotted us into position for launch. The flight deck was a ballet of organized chaos, dozens of aircraft being positioned, last-minute checks being made, pilots climbing into cockpits. I could see the other carriers of Task Force 58 spread out across the horizon: Yorktown, Intrepid, Langley, Independence. Each one was launching its own strike group, adding to the nearly 400 aircraft that would soon be winging their way toward Yamato. It was the largest naval airstrike in history, and we were about to be part of it. The first wave began launching at exactly 0600. I watched the Hellcats and Corsairs thunder down the deck and climb away toward the north, followed by the SB-2C Helldivers. They'd find Yamato first, soften her up, and hopefully draw some of the sting out of her anti-aircraft defenses. At 0630, it was our turn. The flight deck officer gave me the wind-up signal, and I ran the engine up to full power. Kansas Cyclone strained against her brakes, eager to be airborne. The deck officer dropped his flag, and I released the brakes. The Avenger accelerated down the deck, loaded with fuel and that massive torpedo. For a moment, it felt like we were too heavy to fly, but then the deck fell away beneath us, and we were airborne, climbing into the morning sky. Below us, the Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, deep blue and empty except for the white wakes of Task Force 58. Somewhere out there, 200 miles to the north, Yamato was steaming toward her final battle. The hunt had begun. The first 2 hours of the flight were routine, just blue ocean and scattered clouds as far as the eye could see. Our strike group of 36 TBM Avengers flew in a loose formation, weaving back and forth to avoid presenting a steady target to any Japanese submarines that might be lurking below. The radio chatter was minimal. We were still too far from the target to worry about the enemy picking up our transmissions. I kept checking my instruments, watching fuel consumption and engine temperature. The Avenger was a reliable bird, but she was also heavy, and the Mark 13 torpedo slung beneath her belly didn't help matters. We were burning fuel at a steady rate, and I calculated we'd have about 90 minutes over the target area before we had to head home. At 0815, the radio crackled to life. "Bounty Base, this is Able Leader." It was Commander Peterson, leading the first wave of Hellcats. Contact. Enemy surface force bearing 045, distance approximately 60 miles from my position. Yamato and escorts proceeding south, speed 24 knots. My heart started pounding. After months of hearing about Yamato, we were finally going to see her with our own eyes. "Able Leader, this is Bounty Base," came the reply from the Hornet's Combat Information Center. "Confirm contact with primary target." Bounty Base affirmative. "Primary target confirmed." "She's a big one, sir." Repeat. "She's a big one." I switched to our squadron frequency. Cyclone Leader, this is Cyclone 2. Did you copy that transmission? Roger, Cyclone 2, came the reply from Lieutenant Commander Harrison, our squadron leader. Looks like we've found our dance partner. All Cyclone aircraft maintain formation and prepare for attack approach. The next few minutes seemed to drag by. I could see other aircraft in the distance, dive bombers from the Yorktown and Intrepid, more torpedo bombers from the Langley. We were all converging on the same point, like arrows drawing together toward a single target. At 0830, I saw the first signs of battle. Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire began blooming in the sky about 20 miles ahead, followed by the distant sound of explosions. The first wave had found Yamato and was beginning their attack. Cyclone aircraft, this is Cyclone Leader. Harrison's voice came over the radio. Enemy force is at our 12 o'clock, distance 15 miles. I can see the flak. Looks like a real fireworks show up there. I strained my eyes, looking ahead through the scattered clouds. At first, I saw nothing but blue ocean and white cloud wisps. Then, gradually, I began to make out tiny specks on the water, ships arranged in a rough circle, with one much larger speck in the center. Danny's voice came over the intercom from the rear cockpit. Will you look at the size of that thing? Even from 15 miles away, Yamato was impressive. She was easily twice the size of any battleship I'd ever seen. Her massive superstructure and gun turrets clearly visible even at this distance. She was surrounded by smaller ships, the cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, but they looked like toys compared to the enormous battleship in their center. And she was putting up one of a fight. The sky around the Japanese formation was filled with black bursts of anti-aircraft fire, so thick it looked like you could walk on it. I could see the tiny specks of American aircraft diving and climbing through the flak, pressing home their attacks despite the withering defensive fire. Cyclone Leader, this is Cyclone 2, I called. I count at least 6 aircraft down already. It was true, I could see the smoke columns rising from the water where American planes had been shot down. Roger, Cyclone 2. All aircraft prepare for attack approach. We're going to split into 2 groups, odd-numbered aircraft attack from port, even-numbered aircraft attack from starboard. Try to coordinate your runs so we hit her from both sides simultaneously. The tactic made sense. Yamato's massive anti-aircraft battery would have trouble tracking multiple targets coming from different directions at the same time. But it also meant that half of us would be attacking without direct support from the other half. As Cyclone 2, I was assigned to the starboard attack group. I began descending toward the water, dropping down to about 100 feet above the waves. The other torpedo bombers in my group, Cyclone 4, 6, 8, and 10, spread out into a loose line abreast formation. The plan was simple: approach at high speed and low altitude, drop the torpedo at about 1,000 yards from the target, then get the out of there. The Mark 13 torpedoes were set to run at a depth of 10 feet, which should put them right into Yamato's hull below her armored belt. Simple in theory. In practice, it meant flying straight into the teeth of the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire in the Pacific. At 0845, we began our final approach. Yamato was now clearly visible ahead of us, and she was even more massive than the intelligence reports had suggested. Her main battery of 9 18-inch guns was trained out to starboard, and I could see the secondary batteries of 6-inch guns swinging toward us. But it was the anti-aircraft guns that concerned me most, dozens of 25mm and 40mm mounts, all of them spitting fire in our direction. The first flak bursts appeared about 2 miles out, black puffs of smoke that seemed to hang in the air like deadly flowers. I could hear the metallic ringing of shrapnel hitting Kansas Cyclone's fuselage, but the engines were still running smoothly and the controls felt normal. Cyclone 2, this is Cyclone Leader. Harrison's voice crackled over the radio. Port group is beginning their attack run now. Stand by for coordinated attack. I could see the port attack group about a mile to my left, 5 TBM Avengers boring in toward Yamato's port side. They were taking heavy fire. One of them was already trailing smoke, and another seemed to be having engine trouble. Starboard group, this is Cyclone 2, I called. Prepare for attack run. Target is the big boy in the center. Let's make this count. The flak was getting thicker now. close enough that I could feel the concussion from the explosions. A burst just off my starboard wing rocked the Avenger, and I could smell cordite and hot metal. But we were committed now, too close to turn back, too far from safety to do anything but press the attack home. 1,000 yards. 800. 600. Yamato was enormous now, filling my windscreen, her massive superstructure bristling with gun mounts. I could see Japanese sailors on her decks, could make out the details of her bridge structure, could even see the rising sun flag flying from her mainmast. 400 yards. Time to drop. Torpedo away, I called, pulling the release lever. The Avenger lurched upward as the 2,000-pound Mark 13 fell away from her belly. I immediately banked hard to starboard, trying to get clear of Yamato's defensive fire. Behind me, Danny was firing his .50 caliber turret gun at the Japanese anti-aircraft positions, adding his own small contribution to the chaos of battle. I could hear him cursing over the intercom as tracer rounds zipped past our aircraft. "Nice drop, Lieutenant," he called. "That fish is running hot, straight, and normal." I banked around to watch the results of our attack. The torpedo from Kansas Cyclone was indeed running true, its wake clearly visible in the blue water as it raced toward Yamato's starboard side. The other torpedoes from our group were also in the water, 5 parallel wakes converging on the massive battleship. For a moment, it looked like we might actually hit her. The torpedoes were running at the right depth and the right speed, and Yamato was too big and too slow to avoid them all. Then the world exploded. The first torpedo hit Yamato on her port side, just forward of her bridge. Even from 2 miles away, I could see the massive column of water and debris that erupted from her hull. The explosion was so powerful that it seemed to lift the entire forward section of the battleship out of the water for an instant before she crashed back down. "Got her," Danny's voice crackled over the intercom. "Direct hit on the port side. But Yamato was built to take punishment. Her designers had given her the thickest armor ever put on a warship, and her internal compartments were designed to contain flooding from multiple torpedo hits. The massive battleship shuddered from the impact, listed slightly to port, but kept steaming south toward Okinawa. Then the second torpedo hit, and the third. The port side attack group had scored at least 3 hits, maybe 4. I could see water pouring into Yamato's hull through the gaping holes torn in her side, but she was still afloat, still fighting. "Cyclone aircraft. This is Cyclone Leader." Harrison's voice came over the radio. "Good work on that attack run." "Reform on me 4. His transmission was cut off by a massive explosion. I looked around frantically and saw Cyclone Leader spinning toward the water, her port wing completely gone, fuel streaming from her tanks. Harrison and his crew never had a chance. The Avenger hit the water at 200 knots and disappeared in a spray of foam and debris. "Cyclone Leader is down," I called over the radio. "Cyclone Leader is down." As the senior surviving pilot, command of the squadron fell to me. It was a responsibility I'd never wanted, but there wasn't time to think about it. The battle was still raging around us, and Yamato was still very much alive. The dive bombers from the first wave were making their runs now, SB-2C Helldivers screaming down from 12,000 feet with 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. I watched them dive through the flak, their wings folding back as they built up speed, before releasing their bombs and pulling out just above the water. Most of the bombs missed. Yamato was turning hard to port now, trying to present a smaller target, but I saw at least 2 direct hits on her superstructure. One bomb struck her forward funnel, sending a geyser of steam and smoke skyward. Another hit her aft superstructure, destroying several anti-aircraft gun mounts and starting a fire that spread rapidly through her upper works. But still she fought on. Her main battery was firing now, the 9 18-inch guns launching shells the size of small cars at some unseen target. The muzzle blasts were so powerful that they seemed to shake the very air around the battleship, and I could see the shock waves rippling across the water. All aircraft, came a transmission from the Hornet's Air Group commander. "This is Bounty Base. Third wave is approaching target area. Recommend immediate withdrawal to avoid interference." The third wave, another 150 aircraft from the carriers of Task Force 58. They'd be arriving in about 15 minutes, and the sky was already crowded enough with American planes, Japanese flak, and the debris of battle. But I wasn't ready to leave yet. Yamato was hurt, but she wasn't finished. Her list to port was getting worse, and I could see that her speed was dropping, but she was still steaming toward Okinawa. If she reached the landing beaches, those 18-inch guns would turn our beachhead into a slaughter pen. Cyclone aircraft. This is Cyclone 2, I called over the radio. We still have fish left. Anyone with torpedoes remaining, form up on me for another attack run. 3 voices replied, Cyclone 6, 8, and 10. 4 aircraft, 4 torpedoes. Maybe enough to finish the job. We began our second approach from the southwest, staying low to avoid the worst of the flak. Yamato was turning toward us now, her bow pointing almost directly at our formation. It was a smart move. By heading toward us, she was presenting the smallest possible target, and her forward batteries could concentrate their fire on our approach. The anti-aircraft fire was even heavier now, if that was possible. The Japanese gunners had had time to find our range, and they were putting up a wall of steel that seemed impossible to penetrate. I felt shrapnel tear through Kansas Cyclone's starboard wing, and my oil pressure gauge flickered ominously. Cyclone 2, this is Cyclone 6, Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. I'm hit pretty bad. Don't think I can make the run. I looked to my left and saw Morrison's Avenger trailing smoke from her engine. As I watched, her propeller stopped turning, and she began losing altitude rapidly. Cyclone 6. Try to make it back to the task force, I called. We'll finish this. Morrison's reply was lost in the static of battle, but I saw him banking away from the target, trying to nurse his damaged aircraft back toward the carriers. I never found out if he made it. That left 3 of us, myself, Lieutenant Patterson in Cyclone 8, and Ensign Williams in Cyclone 10. 3 aircraft against the most powerful battleship ever built. The flak was so thick now that it seemed solid, a wall of black smoke and orange flame that stretched across our path. I felt Kansas Cyclone shudder as shrapnel tore through her fuselage, and I could hear Danny cursing over the intercom as he tried to return fire with his 50 caliber gun, 800 yards, 600. I could see individual Japanese sailors on Yamato's decks now, some of them firing rifles at our aircraft. It was a futile gesture, but it showed the kind of determination we were up against. 400 yards. Time to drop. Torpedo away, I called, pulling the release lever for the second time. But this time, something went wrong. The Mark 13 hung up on its release mechanism, refusing to drop cleanly. Kansas Cyclone was still carrying 2,000 pounds of explosive death beneath her belly as I banked hard to starboard, trying to clear Yamato's defensive fire. Lieutenant, Danny's voice was urgent over the intercom. The fish didn't drop. We're still carrying. I looked down and saw that he was right. The torpedo was still there, hung up on the release mechanism, making Kansas Cyclone heavy and sluggish. We were flying directly over Yamato now, and every anti-aircraft gun on the ship seemed to be firing at us. That's when I saw the opportunity. Yamato's forward 18-inch gun turret was directly below us, its 3 massive guns trained out to starboard. If I could get the torpedo to drop now, it would land right on top of the turret. Hang on, Danny, I called, and put Kansas Cyclone into a steep dive directly toward Yamato's foredeck. The airspeed indicator needle climbed rapidly, 150 knots, 200, 250. The Avenger was never designed to dive at such speeds, and I could feel her wings flexing under the strain. But we were committed now, diving straight down into the teeth of Yamato's anti-aircraft fire. At 200 feet, I pulled the emergency torpedo release. This time, the Mark 13 dropped cleanly, falling like a stone toward Yamato's forward turret. I pulled back on the stick, trying to level out before we hit the water, but the Avenger was heavy and slow to respond. We leveled out at 50 feet, so low that I could see the faces of the Japanese sailors on Yamato's deck. Then the torpedo hit. The explosion was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The Mark 13 struck Yamato's forward turret and detonated, sending a column of flame and smoke 300 feet into the air. The blast was so powerful that it flipped Kansas Cyclone completely over, and for a moment I was flying upside down, looking up at the ocean and down at the sky. I managed to roll the Avenger back to level flight, but she was badly damaged. The engine was running rough, oil pressure was dropping, and I could see daylight through holes in both wings. But we were alive, and we'd hit Yamato where it hurt. "Lieutenant," Danny's voice was shaky over the intercom. "Did you see that? We took out her whole forward turret." I looked back at Yamato and saw that he was right. The battleship's forward 18-inch gun turret was gone, replaced by a smoking crater. The explosion had also started fires throughout her forward superstructure, and her list to port was getting noticeably worse. But she was still afloat, still fighting. Even with multiple torpedo hits, bomb damage, and the loss of her forward turret, Yamato continued steaming south toward Okinawa. She was a tough ship, built by men who understood that battles were won by the side that refused to quit. Unfortunately for them, we understood that too. The third wave arrived at 9:30, and with it came the beginning of the end for Yamato. 150 aircraft from the carriers of Task Force 58, Hellcats, Corsairs, Helldivers, and Avengers, descended on the Japanese formation like a swarm of angry hornets. I was flying Kansas Cyclone at about 2,000 feet, trying to nurse her damaged engine back toward the task force, when the new wave of attackers swept past us. The sky was suddenly full of American aircraft, more than I'd ever seen in one place at one time. Cyclone 2. "This is Bounty Base," came a transmission from the Hornets Combat Information Center. "What's your status?" "Bounty Base, this is Cyclone 2, I replied. "We're damaged but still flying. Primary target has taken multiple torpedo hits and is listing to port. Her forward main battery turret is destroyed, but she's still steaming south." "Roger, Cyclone 2. Can you maintain station to observe and report?" I looked at my fuel gauge and engine instruments. We had maybe 30 minutes of fuel left, and the engine was running rough, but it was still running. "Affirmative, Bounty Base. We can maintain station." From our position above the battle, I had a perfect view of the final assault on Yamato. The fresh wave of attackers came in from all directions, coordinating their attacks to overwhelm the battleship's defenses. The Hellcats and Corsairs swept in first, strafing the anti-aircraft positions and keeping the Japanese gunners' heads down. Then came the dive bombers, screaming down from high altitude with their 1,000-pound bombs. Yamato was putting up a desperate fight, but she was clearly in trouble. Her list to port was now about 15 degrees, and she was down by the bow from the flooding caused by the torpedo hits. Smoke was pouring from multiple fires throughout her superstructure, and I could see that several of her anti-aircraft gun mounts had been knocked out. But it was the torpedo bombers of the third wave that delivered the killing blow. Unlike our scattered attacks, these crews had time to coordinate their approach. They came in from both sides simultaneously, 12 TBM Avengers dropping their Mark 13 torpedoes in a perfectly timed attack. I watched the torpedo wakes streak through the water toward Yamato Shoal. The battleship was trying to turn to present a smaller target, but she was too slow and too badly damaged to avoid them all. The first torpedo hit her amidships on the port side, directly in her engineering spaces. The explosion was enormous, sending a geyser of water and steam hundreds of feet into the air. Yamato's speed immediately dropped to less than 10 knots, and her list to port increased dramatically. Then the second torpedo hit, and the third, and the fourth. Each explosion tore massive holes in Yamato's hull, allowing thousands of tons of seawater to pour into her compartments. The battleship began to settle lower in the water, her bow disappearing beneath the waves.